It's time to sit back, relax, and listen to Conversations with Joan. Conversations with Joan will inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. And now, here's your host, Joan Herman.
Welcome to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life's Conversations with Joan. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in. Conversations with Joan focuses on topics that are important to your life, from health and wellness to professional development to personal well-being. Change makers join me to share their insights, tips, and strategies so you can thrive and live your best life now. Thank you for taking time for yourself, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life. Now, let's start talking. When we talk about staying healthy, we usually discuss diet or exercise. The one area that is often overlooked is our command center, the brain. Brain health is a critical piece of overall health. It controls the ability to communicate, make decisions, problem solve, and live a productive life. Joining us today to talk about how we can maintain a healthy brain is Dr. Gary Simonds, a brain surgeon who spent his life caring for the sickest of the sick. Dr. Simonds is an author whose latest book is Death's Pale Flag. Welcome, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
Well, Doctor, it's really interesting because we check everything out in our lives. We get EKGs and colonoscopies and we have mammograms, and yet we don't pay a whole lot of attention to what is really controlling everything. So why do you think we don't give our brain so much consideration?
I think it's probably, one thing is I think we probably take a lot for granted. I guess we do with our heart as well. It's there working away all the time, and we don't really think of it unless there's problems. But certainly the brain is always going. I mean, it's nonstop, right? It's always going, and it's kind of multitasking all the time. And I think we're just used to the machinery running for itself.
When I started doing this work, I really had the opportunity to learn a lot about the brain. I remember growing up in science class, we were kind of taught that you have a brain, and then as you get older, it degenerates, and then you're going to lose the function. But now there's just so much exciting research about how our brain can keep growing and evolving and changing. And so what are some of the biggest brain issues that you see happening today?
Well, let me start with your first commentary, because I think it's very interesting. I think for the longest time, we as human beings, and really most of us through most of our development have seen the brain as a pretty static thing. We kind of learned that neurons are made, and they if they're lost, they're not replaced. And all these connections are made as we're developing as an embryo, and then in maybe early life. And then we just kind of think of it all as, okay, the wiring is set. It's just like a computer. All the wires are soldered together and set up the way they're supposed to be, and that's the way it's going to be. And then over time, we're going to lose a bunch of wires because, the machinery goes through a lot, and therefore it's natural to be losing things as time goes on, losing function, losing abilities. But the reality is that the brain is a remarkably dynamic organ. It is changing nonstop. It changes on so many levels, on kind of a macroscopic level, which parts of the brain are being active at any one time, which parts of the brain are getting an increased amount of oxygen and blood flow. But then as you go more and more microscopic, the connections between neurons, of which there are billions, there's actually trillions of connections and billions of neurons. But all those connections that we tend to think are just wiring that are set up and left to go, they are changing all the time. If you use certain connections a lot, those connections are strengthened. If you don't, those connections are weakened. And all the way down on the microscopic level where one neuron meets another in what's called a synapse, where they communicate from one neuron to another. That's a very dynamic situation as well. The receptors that one neuron has waiting for neurotransmitters to be delivered aren't static. They change in number. They change in their ability to receive neurochemicals. So anyway, it's a long way of saying this. The system is constantly in flux, constantly changing, constantly adapting to the environment. So if the environment is a positive, growth-oriented environment, there is a good chance that brain is going to work better all the time. If the environment is toxic and depleting, well, the brain is going to show the effects of that.
You were describing when we behave in a certain way or think in a certain way repeatedly, it strengthens particular pathways. But if we wanted to change those pathways and create new ones, what would we have to do in order to make that happen?
Yeah, I think when we get to that level of consideration, we have to take a little bit of a leap of faith in that we don't know exactly, even though I said it's very dynamic and it's always changing, we don't know 100% for sure that we are indeed changing things for the better. We see it more on a macroscopic level, where we know, for example, that there are behaviors that are protective against things such as depression or such as dementia. And they're fairly straightforward behaviors when you think about it, but things that we kind of take for granted and say, oh, yeah, sure, of course that would do it, but then we don't necessarily do it. So, very, very clear and common things such as keeping good nutrition, keeping the right chemicals going into your body would be one. Exercising has been shown to be of great help. Maintaining the relationships that are important to you. Continuous learning, always feeding your brain new information, new learning are all great. Getting sleep, getting rest when you're supposed to have it. Exposing yourself to new experiences, seeing new places, thinking about new things, as well as giving your brain a break. So giving the brain some meditation time, some quiet time, and so forth. All these things that we may take for granted and just assume, oh yeah, they're probably good for the brain. When you actually look at it in terms of populations and their susceptibility to things like dementia or depression, there is definitely a strong correlation. But if you were to say, okay, Simonds, then what pathway exactly is being strengthened by this? Or what new connections are you making? I can't tell you. I don't think anybody can tell you specifically. We can look at the brain with things called functional MRI and see certain areas of the brain light up more, meaning they're being used more. But again, that's on a very macroscopic level. It doesn't get down to the very fine connections that are going on between these billions of neurons.
Do you think someone who may have experienced a stroke or a brain tumor or any type of injury to the brain, do you think what you're seeing in the research, is there hope and some exciting things coming up that may help the brain to heal or even regenerate?
Yeah, I think we are a long way off still from being able to encourage or implant new neurons, if you will, and say, go grow and make the connections that you're supposed to. The setting up of the connections is very complex and really requires kind of the early development of the brain for the processes of the neurons to pass by the areas that they need to get to. Anyway, it is quite quite a challenge to say, here, let's get some new neurons in there and grow to other regions. But there is a lot of interest in, can we strengthen, reestablish, work around areas of damage. And there is certainly research into the idea of starting up new neurons. But I would say, in all reality, it's got a ways to go. Another huge area, though, that we're going to see much sooner, probably, I would bet, is marrying up our nervous systems with the computer world, with microelectronics, where we will be able to connect areas of the nervous system to one another, or even to robotics, even to exoskeletons and robotics and stuff like that, where you'll be, and this is being done right now, where you'll be able to say, with a brain that has paralysis on one side of the body, to be able to use a bioelectronic interface and be able to think, move your arm, and if there's an exoskeleton with robotics attached, to be able to actually move that arm. And there's actually some research going on right now of kind of bypassing areas within the spinal cord with electronics, and just kind of reconnecting the brain to the spinal cord beyond an injury with electronics, and be able to get movement in paralyzed limbs. So that field of connecting the nervous system with, the magic of our modern day computer systems and robotics is really going to explode, as well as implanting various types of electrode systems, electronics, into the brain itself, and altering how the brain is functioning when it is, when it is dysfunctioning. The classic example right now is with Parkinson's disease, where when the movement disorder component of Parkinson's disease gets bad enough, we're able to put electrodes deep into the brain, into certain very small areas of the brain, and remarkably improve a lot of the symptoms. This component of taking care of the brain is really about to explode. I mean, it's going to go in so many directions. And you've certainly heard of the billionaires getting interested in this, with people like Elon Musk putting a fair amount of money into research in that interface. And it's certainly out there in all sorts of university labs.
Do you think this is something that we'll see in our lifetime?
Yeah, I think we'll definitely see well, I may be stretching it when I say my lifetime. I guess I'm getting on there, but
well, me too.
But this is coming fast and furious, and I mean, we're already implanting these electrodes for various disorders, and that list of disorders is going to expand rapidly. Seizure disorders, various behavioral disorders, a whole list of diseases. I think it's going to certainly come up with seizures and stroke care and stuff like that. But that bioelectronic interface as well, where you're moving robotics, or you're reconnecting to somewhere else in the nervous system, that's coming fast and furious too. So yeah, I think, and then, like I said, when you hear the billionaires interested in this, and you start getting industrial money and support behind it, it's probably going to come on very rapidly in the next several years, and in the next decade for sure.
Well, it's exciting for people that are trying to navigate different types of health issues. But I want to focus a little bit more now on the things that we can do, that we can empower ourselves to do, so that we can avoid some of those issues that you've just mentioned. So I think one of the biggest things you were talking about, or a few of the biggest things, were diet and exercise and stress reduction. And so let's just chunk those three down, because I think those are the three biggest areas that we have control over. So talking about stress, you know, we live in such a hyper stressed out society, and our bodies are constantly in that fight or flight response mode. So when we are in that mode and we have those chemicals that are through our body, what happens in the brain when we are so stressed?
Yeah, this is a particular field of interest of mine. To be honest, I kind of got hooked into it about 15 years ago or so, and got very interested in burnout in healthcare workers. As you can imagine, the stress levels there can be, kind of off the scale. I've actually written 3 books on burnout in healthcare workers that came before the current book that is a novel, but it still gets into burnout in one specific healthcare worker, a neurosurgeon. But we know that with persistent stress, that we kind of overcome our coping mechanisms, our ability to overcome the stress and soldier on, if you will. Now, again, where is that occurring deep down in the brain? You can have all sorts of hypotheticals. I don't think, again, that we have that specifically mapped out to these basic connections and these basic structures. But we know the amygdala, the limbic system, the prefrontal the prefrontal cortices, the cingulate gyrus, all these structures within the brain are involved when we continue to stress it out. And we are probably once again influencing pathways of stress response, of our flight or fight responses, and really just kind of grooving those connections. So that becomes almost a state of being for us, to be hyper alerted, kind of anticipating the worst rather than the best, seeking out proof that we're right about our worries and our concerns, as opposed to seeking out the things that uplift our days and that sort of thing. So I think on a microscopic level, yeah, we are probably influencing those connections and strengthening them, and just continuing to fire off those neurons, if you will, to the point that becomes the dominant strategy or the dominant patterns. But it's exhausting. The system is not designed to be constantly fighting for survival. It needs some downtime and eventually exhausts itself out. And I think that's one of the main components of burnout is an emotional exhaustion that is, we don't just restore by going to bed that night. So then we end up in a sometimes chronic state of emotional exhaustion.
And so what about diet? What are the things that we should be avoiding and adding in to promote brain health?
Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. Let's go with a well-rounded, balanced diet. And I know people are inclined to take a lot of vitamins or look for the magical food. And the reality is, we know that good diet and good brain health certainly is going to come from a truly good old-fashioned balanced diet. We can look it up in any really nutritional textbook in terms of not overdoing it with any one specific food group or one specific type of food. If we do that, we actually ingest an appropriate amount of vitamins and nutrients and basic elements, and we'll keep ourselves going. So again, pretty straightforward stuff of a lot of fruit and vegetables with a reasonable protein mix in there. We need some fat, and then to avoid all the kind of the foods that we already know are potentially harmful. Heavy on the sweets, heavy on the fat. The big juicy cheeseburgers that taste really good, and the fries and the big ice creams afterwards. In moderation are fine, but in large doses are harmful on multiple levels. The big level, the most direct ones are simply they lead to atherosclerosis, and atherosclerosis is very harmful to the brain, even if it doesn't involve big strokes. It is robbing the brain of the vital blood supply it needs on a microscopic level. And it's interesting because, our desire for those foods are coming out of the brain. The brain was not prepared for modern life. The brain was prepared for the way humans existed for a long, long time, which was that there wasn't a lot of food around. And if we could get a source of high fat every so often, eat it up real quick. It's going to taste good to us because it's the source of a huge amount of calories. But, in modern living now, it's so plentiful that the brain hasn't quite figured out that, you got plenty, you got enough. You can take that in moderation. So we have to actually tell the brain that. We actually have to override our hunger for some of the more harmful foods.
Part of my physical, I recently just had a cardiac score test done to check for plaque and blockages. Are there any types of brain tests that we should be having done as part of our routine preventative physicals just to see what's going on in there?
Currently, there isn't a lot of scientific support. In other words, scientific studies looking at populations, but there isn't good support for doing any sort of basic screening test of the brain on any real level, be it blood vessel tests, MRI scanning, that sort of thing. There really isn't a lot of strong evidence that would be good for us. In a basic primary care mode, mini mental status exams are kind of common, particularly in older people, to look for the early signs of dementia, for example. But that's about as far as it goes. So nobody right now is recommending getting for example, a major blood vessel screening test for the blood vessels going into the brain. Now, for somebody who has had symptoms like a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, or a small stroke or something like that, that changes the dynamic, and all sorts of testing might be done. So, kind of the best test and probably the best judge of all, better than any doctor, better than any MRI, is our own attendance to ourselves. And one of the things that we've certainly learned in the burnout and resilience world, in dealing with it, and healthcare workers at least, but I know this goes for the entire population, is that we are all lousy in what we call self-compassion. And self-compassion can be looked at in many different ways, but the way we like to look at it is just a knowing oneself, an ability to kind of really hone down on how we're doing, how are we performing, how are we responding to our environment, what brings us up, what gets us down, really knowing ourselves. How are things working? How are we thinking? How are we processing? We're not very good at that as a species. We tend to focus on others quite a bit, and we almost will give in to a guilt if we start thinking about ourselves. Now, I'm not advocating rampant narcissism where all we do is think about ourselves, but I think we do periodically need to think about, well, geez, how am I doing? How am I thinking? How am I processing? What is working for me? What is not working for me? Because how do we know to tend to ourselves if we're not doing that? But if we are doing it, if we're pretty darn aware of how our system is working, it then becomes much easier to determine, to get a sense of when it's not working, when there's a misfire, when not all the pistons are firing or something like that. And then we're able to potentially bring it to attention. But again, we're just not all that geared towards doing that. And I think that would definitely be a good thing, because we are the best judge of how it's all going down.
And Doctor, where can our listeners go to get information about your new book and any of your work?
I have a website that basically is my name with a .com. So it's Gary, G-A-R-Y-R, Simonds, S-I-M-O-N-D-S, .com. And all the books are discussed there amongst various other topics. And I'm, part of the reason for doing this is I'm really interested in talking to people about a whole wealth of subjects that all of the books raise. And I can't tell you how much I enjoy this sort of discussion where we can kind of really get into the weeds, if you will, on what's good for us, what's not so good for us, what are our challenges, how can we help ourselves and help each other, hopefully. So I really hope people do access it and contact me, and I'm delighted to talk to anybody about these subjects.
Well, Doctor, I'm so happy that you spent this time with us, because I'm fascinated by the brain. So I would love to have you come back, because there's so much more that I would love to ask you.
Yeah, I would be delighted to. I think we're scratching the surface of where we can go with all this.
Once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the show informative. At Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life, we believe that knowledge is power. Take what you've learned, apply it, and live your best life now. Remember that the information provided is the opinion of our guest and should never replace the advice of a professional who knows your personal situation. If you'd like more information, visit our website, cyacyl.com. That stands for Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. While on our site, listen to past shows on demand, read the digital magazine, sign up for our mailing list, and be sure to follow the show on social media. Until next time, this is Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in.